many people from the LGBT community have come through a kind of a whole history of things, and when they go into a care situation, there's always that concern, do they have to come out again? Do they have to sort of actually put on a sort of a face that I'm just want to fit in? So those kind of dilemmas are really kind of quite problematic.
I often chose to spend time with Hazel in her room, because if I greeted her with a kiss or with an affectionate name in the main lounge, I felt quite on show, and I became aware that our relationship was visible in a way that was different to, the probable heterosexual relationships around us.
Charities often pick up the heavy work of providing this gap where there are no statutory services that are culturally competent and available for LGBTQ plus people living with and affected by dementia. Those charities sort of step in.
Right, we are live. So, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Today, as it is the end of Pride Month, a really exciting times, we want to be talking about how dementia affects all backgrounds, but how there is some different experiences for those within the LGBTQ community. Today, we're really lucky to be joined with some experienced guests in this area, but I think it's really key to understand that this conversation is an important one to be having. There has been huge social change over the last 50 years, which has led to people within the LGBTQ plus community having a very different experience of dementia care. And as you know, we advocate at Dementia Adventure for dementia care to be fully inclusive. And if we're not having these conversations, this isn't going to happen. So I'm going to start by asking our guests to introduce themselves. Sandra, I'll work through the screen. I'll go with who's on order. So Sandra, thank you for joining us today. Would you like to introduce yourself to all the viewers?
Hi, I'm Sandra, and I have lived experience of my partner of 20 years, Hazel, through her journey with logopenic aphasia, a rare form of dementia. And I'm also a couples therapist and trainer of therapists and a writer, which were all things that really helped me in that journey.
Amazing. Thank you, Sandra. And Paul, you've joined us as well?
Yes, so I'm from Rainbow Communities, a relatively new charity that helps support people that are lonely and isolated. And within that, we support people that are living with dementia and those that care for people with dementia with a particular LGBT plus context, which will become more obvious as we dive into the conversation later.
Definitely, thank you. And John, last but not least.
Yeah, hi, lovely to be here. I'm John, and I am currently a PhD student at Brighton Sussex Medical School at the Centre for Dementia Studies. My research focuses on the experiences of LGBTQ plus people with dementia using photography. So asking people with dementia to explore their experiences through photography. And I worked in the community for many years for the charity Brighton and Hove LGBT Switchboard. So yeah, good to be here.
Brilliant. Thank you. We have really valued the voices that we've got on today's session. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. If you've got any questions, do pop them in the chat and we will aim to answer those as we go through today's session. But if we can't answer them, we absolutely will come back to you after today's session. So let's start by just trying to understand the landscape a little bit. John, I'm going to ask you, why is it important to be talking specifically about the LGBTQ plus experiences of dementia?
I think primarily we need, just generally in sort of dementia care, to keep humanizing the experiences of what it is to live with dementia. And for LGBTQ plus people with dementia, there's sort of two essential strands or discourses, I guess. So the experiences of what it's like to identify as LGBTQ plus, and then the experiences of living with dementia. So I guess if we think about LGBTQ plus people, we have to be very careful, as always, not to homogenize that experience. It's very convenient to lump us all within the alphabet and imagine that we're all living a very kind of equitable and comparable life, and that's just not true. So that's very important, I guess. So for LGBTQ plus people, we have to think about other considerations like age, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, living arrangements, where we live, all of those kind of things as well. But generally, we understand that typically for older LGBTQ plus people, they've lived through significant social and historical change. And in the UK, we know they're likely to have grown up when relationships were criminalized or pathologized and stigmatized, I guess. And this undoubtedly influences trust in institutions such as health and social care, including dementia care. And then I guess if we think about dementia as a kind of other part of the LGBTQ plus and dementia, we know from research that there are kind of 14 risk factors for later life dementia. And because of those kind of systemic inequalities and inequities, things like adverse mental health, social isolation, increased alcohol and drug use, and inequalities in health, such as increased risk of poor cardiovascular health or stroke, mean that LGBTQ plus people are arguably even at greater risk of dementia than the majority population. So they're also more likely to be estranged from families of origin, more likely to live alone, less likely to have children, and so they're likely to have very different support structures. So I guess to sum up, for me, dementia is it's still a stigmatized condition, and people experience discrimination because they're living with dementia, and there's some parallel, I guess, to LGBTQ identities as well. So understanding more and more about how dementia and LGBTQ plus identities overlap and intersect is something we still need to explore more and more.
And I think it's really key to understand, isn't it, that there is some really small little tweaks and changes that actually, certainly us as professionals can make those barriers and those challenges diminish somewhat. It's about having that understanding. It's about, slight changes in terminology that can make all the difference to people actually feeling trusted and feeling safe when accessing professional support to maybe less so in their previous experiences.
Absolutely.
John, do you find that the people who come and access your services maybe have got those different family support structures and that's why they're accessing your services? Or do you find it's because you are that trusted friendly face? They do recognise that actually I'm safe here, and then they will use you to use that sort of signposting to access further support? Sorry, Paul. That question was for you, sorry.
I think one of the key things about accessing support is the issue of trust, which has already been mentioned. And as we said, that many people from the LGBT community have come through kind of a whole history of things, and when they go into a care situation, there's always that concern. Do they have to come out again? Do they have to sort of actually put on a sort of a face that I'm just want to fit in? So those kind of dilemmas are really kind of quite problematic for individuals, and particularly so for their carers and loved ones. Sort of the fact that often assumptions will be made in terms of the gender of the partner, what the relationship is of the person that comes with them. So all these things are really kind of very problematic and form difficult additional hurdles to that when people are going through their journey on dementia. I think it's important to mention as well that everybody's at a different stage in terms of how aware they are. They may forget that who their partner is. So there's lots of complications, I think, in terms of the way people perceive things. And from a professional point of view, I think it's a case of the professionals shouldn't presume anything. They shouldn't assume the gender and the relationship of family. As we said, often biological family won't be very, they may have been cut off completely. So the family we choose, they may be close friends, neighbours. It's a case of being open-minded, I think, as far as professionals are concerned, and taking into account that they shouldn't presume in terms of, but to ask open questions and to make everybody feel open, that they can be themselves, and just treat them equally so that they feel comfortable and they get respect, basically.
Thanks, Paul. That's really helpful. Sandra, I'd love to bring you in at this point and just find out if and what some of the challenges were that you might have faced on that journey caring for your partner.
Yeah, I thought about a couple of things. Yeah, so one was, when we went to the memory clinic for Hazel's assessment, and we were obviously already frightened by what we might hear. Was it dementia? What did it mean for our future? But there's always that other underlying question as well about how are we going to be received as a lesbian couple? Because for us, it was
Mhm.
just like we were out, that was it. I be recognized as her partner? Would we be treated with respect? As it turned out, the psychiatrist was great. But until we knew that, there is that whole extra layer of
Mm.
vulnerability on top of everything else. And that vulnerability, that uncertainty doesn't just happen once. Every time you meet new professionals or services, there's that tension. Do I come out here, or is it just a little thing, a one-off that is really not worth the effort, or do I come out and what do I do with the effect of what happens then?
Mm.
So that was one of them, and then another one that might be in some ways a little bit more subtle is that she was in a nursing home for 4 years. They're very communal places. Conversations happen in corridors, they happen in lounges. Everyone knows everybody else's business. And the staff were very accepting of us, which was great. But, if someone asked, who is that visiting Hazel, they'd be like, oh, that's Sandra, her partner. And so my question, my query wasn't about the staff, but it was about, how is this person who's just heard that receiving it?
Mm.
And, that publicness meant that I often chose to spend time with Hazel in her room. Because if I greeted her with a kiss or with an affectionate name in the main lounge, I felt quite on show. And I became aware that our relationship was visible in a way that was different to, the probable heterosexual relationships around us. It
Mm.
wasn't that I was expecting a bad reaction particularly, but I was conscious of being on display.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And it's again, it adds to that additional thoughts around, how should I behave rather than just having to deal with that dementia journey, which is complex enough as it is.
Yes.
I think what I'd really like to do, Sandra, is after what you've just said, we've had a question from Charlie who's joined us, and he's asked, how do I speak up for my loved one if I feel who they are isn't being fully recognised? And I know in the conversations I've had, this is often something that crops up. It's that, how do I support somebody to be recognised for who they are so they can live authentically? And was that something you had to, take on board and address yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a question that has like just such a richness inside it because not taking on board fully, it's like I don't think many people who haven't been around LGBTQ plus people can't take it on fully. So what is it
Mm.
that we're asking for? So one of the things I wanted was for Hazel to, for her relationship to be recognized, for her to be recognized as not just this very infirm person, but the life that she had lived, the person that she
Mm.
had been. So one
Mhm.
of the things that I did was I took in photo books. I took photo books in of her life. I took photo book in of our relationship. I would also get photo cushions and photo blankets, and they had all sorts of significant photos of the people and of her with messages of love on them. So that when she looked around her room, she could see who she had been, who she still was, and also the staff could see her in that way. And what I was also,
Mm.
I mean, it's always matched by vulnerability. Yeah,
Yeah.
because what that also does is say this is who she is, and there's that whole vulnerability of, and how do you respond to that? So, for me, we have to make the choices, and they don't come easily. They always come with a sense of vulnerability as we do that. We have to make the decisions as to what we do and how we do it, and preferably we do it with respect and care for people's lack of awareness, and we
Mhm.
teach people and we hope we're received well with that.
And Paul, do you find that that is an experience that people you work with who come and use your services experience? And is there places people can go to have that advocacy support? Because it's a huge journey, it's a huge complex journey, and actually it's a time when really we do need that advocacy and that support in place. Paul, can I ask you to unmute?
I thought I had. There we go.
Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, it is a big problem, and I think one of the things to protect the relationship is to have a power of attorney, so that irrespective of any judgment or perception, you've got that as a base level, and to do that as early as possible in the journey, so that then decisions that have to be made later are kind of easily understood. I think as Sandra has said, it's a difficult balance. Is this the bridge I want to kind of sort of burn or whatever to get there? Unfortunately, there aren't that many organisations or people that can help support people. I think for us, the best is peer support. So people that are further on that journey, they've come across the same problems, and they'll be, well, practical solution what I did, and then it's one of those things. If they've had real life experience they can share, that's great. If they haven't, when you get a group of people together, it's amazing how good they can be at problem solving. And I think if you're caring for somebody, it's like a military operation. Everything is set to the timepiece, and one of the problems I think is that insufficient time is allowed for the carers of the individuals living. But so there's that well-being balance, so that you've got to effectively psych yourself up for what you think you're going to face. And I always kind of suggest to people, have the worst case scenario and the best case scenario. And the reality is it'll be somewhere in the middle. The worst thing you can do is to hover in one of the extremes and then be disappointed, because you will be disappointed. Whereas if you're prepared for, and then afterwards you can reflect and think, well, that didn't go as badly as I thought, and you can sort of gain that confidence that approach worked. And if you say or do something and it doesn't quite work, well, try a different approach the next time. And don't always feel that, you have to get kind of your message across so intensely. There's more subtle ways of doing things, but it is complex, and there's no sort of easy solution. I think, well, it's a journey that everybody shares and has in a different way.
And John, I can see you nodding away there. Is that something that you've seen and heard and would advocate for as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are, for example, when I worked for Brighton and Hove LGBT Switchboard, they launched an initiative called Rainbow Neighbours. And so what they realised was that long-term care settings are there in our community, but they're kind of impervious, and we can't really. They're our neighbours, but they're kind of closed spaces in our streets or in our communities. And I think for LGBTQ plus people sometimes who live in long-term kind of care settings, whether that's residential care or nursing care, for example, that can be very lonely. It can be a very lonely place to be the only LGBTQ plus person. And also, I guess, being asked to be out in some way as well, or being outed by the service. So what Switchboard did was they had this sort of two-way approach of engaging with the LGBTQ plus person living in the home. So bringing them out to join peer support spaces. So making sure spaces were dementia inclusive. So, older people's groups, for example, were just dementia inclusive spaces. So kind of normalizing, what it is to live with dementia amongst people with dementia. Don't just want to socialize with people with dementia, for example. And also the other kind of part of Rainbow Neighbours was to provide training to care staff about LGBTQ lives. So the things we've kind of touched on today, like the histories, everything will tell us, research tells us, the evidence base tells us that we must understand histories in order to appreciate person-centered care and what somebody might need in their future and who they are as a person. We are all part of our lived history, and LGBTQ plus people have lived very unique histories often. So training to health and care staff is an essential kind of part of this really multi-layered inclusive project, I guess, and like Sandra says, people need to be really clear. What do we want from this? What do we want from what inclusion means and celebrating lives? I guess that's what we want to do. We want to be celebrated. We don't want to be just tolerated or acknowledged. I think we can ask for a bit more than that. All lives should be celebrated. And that includes LGBTQ plus people too. So
absolutely, I think one of the big pieces of learning for me, which in the dementia field, I absolutely have a good grasp on, but I didn't quite recognize the complexities of it. Was we know that sometimes people can revert back to earlier periods of their life, and as we've touched on, haven't we, that's the people that are coming into that care industry now are often people who've had relationships criminalized, maybe had to hide relationships or who they're living as. They haven't been able to live their authentic self for a long period of time. And I think the complexity for partners supporting somebody who suddenly might be fearful of that relationship, fearful, like you say, of being outed, was really challenging. And I wonder if you've got any advice for anybody supporting somebody living with dementia. Maybe Sandra, I'll come to you first. How do we support somebody if they revert back to that period of their life where actually their relationship maybe wasn't seen as something to be celebrated? Because as a carer, I'd imagine that's an incredibly challenging place to be.
Yes, I mean, I didn't have that with Hazel because she had a different form of dementia, so that didn't happen. But it's always been a concern when I, hear people talk about reminiscence therapy and things like that. It's like when if people do all that naively, they're sort of expecting these happy histories, and actually, people, not just LGBT people, have really hard pieces of their history. So I think, those things have to be done with great care. I think the main thing would be, can people listen? And can people have a quiet space so that they're not, shouting that out across the lounge? Can carers who, genuinely be asking about the history that's coming up and also explore the good stuff? Because we can focus too much on the bad stuff. What was the first Pride event that they went to, if they ever went to? What was it like to actually know that they were LGBT and feel good about it? Never mind, as well as what complications did it bring up? How's their life been? I think one of the challenges is that care staff often don't have that much time. And, to sit down and actually, let people explore, let people talk and listen to them respectfully and with curiosity.
So as a carer, the message I'm hearing is put that life story together. Make that a really prevalent part if you're going in to work with care professionals. Because I agree with you, the care industry is tough. You're right. Care staff never go into that role because they don't care, but they are very task focused and there's very big time restraints. So it makes that incredibly difficult. John, would you add to that? What would you say professionals can do better, and how can carers support professionals to do that, in your opinion?
I'm going to give a kind of there's a nice quote from a kind of a paper by Barrett and colleagues that says from a participant who took part in a study of LGBTQ plus person with dementia, saying sexual orientation and arguably gender identity is not a rinse color that you put through your hair. It's fundamental to who you are and how you relate to people. So I think, as Sandra said, that sometimes some of the focus, I guess, has been on this idea that people forget who they might be, but sometimes that's so fundamental and integral to who we are. In this case, it's not a rinse color, like it's always there. You know who you are. You may have had to hide who you are because this, the system has forced you to do that. But it's a good way to look at that. And now I've forgotten your question because I've gone off at my tangent. So
no, not at all.
Ask me again and I'll come up with something clever.
My question was, it was really around, how professionals can engage with people and support them meaningfully, but also how can carers support professionals to do that?
Yes, so I guess what I tell sort of care staff often is, as you said, the starting point is people are typically doing great jobs, and all we're doing, I guess, as far as asking for ever more inclusive practices, just to put some more of the cherry on that kind of care cake, I guess. And some of the tweaks are quite straightforward. Some obviously need a lot more work, but a calendar of events, for example, this is Pride Month. So, like no better time than to kind of celebrate different communities throughout the year. So normalizing celebration of different communities with a calendar of events that run through the year. So that, for example, in care settings, people of any minority or any kind of like part of our society and community can feel celebrated. So I think normalizing that kind of celebration of people, and I think, as Sandra said as well, there's so much richness, I guess, to explore. So pride as a concept is a wonderful place to start. You know, what do people feel proud about? This is Pride Month. You know, this is an obvious opportunity to celebrate our community, but we can do that, you know, as a sort of calendar events in care settings throughout the year.
Brilliant.
I think that's a good starting point, I think.
Thank you, John. And Paul, I'd like to come over to you now if I can, because I think we've touched right the way through this. It's about building those communities, finding that support, you know, and sharing that understanding. Tell me about what rainbow communities do and why that peer support is so valuable in your opinion.
Okay, so Rainbow Communities is there to support people who are lonely and isolated, some of whom are living with dementia, some of whom are living alone or living with their partner, etc. So supporting people with dementia is a sort of just an extra bit of the intersectionality of the complexity, if you like. And to do that, we go out of our way to engage with couples and individuals that are kind of living with dementia and their carers. We go to various dementia fairs and different places. Well, I'll give you an example of how for us it works. So myself and the chair of the charity went along to a dementia fair. There were all different organisations there talking about how people can relive what they enjoy. You know, so it might be the library, it might be the theatre, where people's memories are retained, dancing, all those kind of activities. And then we had a couple arrive, one in a sort of a mobile scooter, you know, wheelchair, and his carer. We sort of talked about them. We had an event a few days later. They came along, highlighted some of the accessibility problems of that venue, which we passed back to the venue. We then invited them. We had a coffee and wellbeing chat weekly. So one of them came to that. And what was absolutely brilliant, the person came in the wheelchair, and there were three people in the room who said, "How are you? We've not seen you for ages." And it was just that recognition, that bringing them back into the community. And then once a month, we have a lunch. So it's kind of a journey. And then in between that, we have online activities where people can be supported, as well as one-to-one support. So I will have conversations with the carers, you know, talk about their challenges, and how we can help support them, signpost them to different organizations that might be able to help on the specifics, because it's a very complex world. You know, there are lots of problems and hurdles that face the carers, and it can be a bit overwhelming. So one of the things we try to do with our peer support groups is to share the practicalities and the advice and the support, so people don't feel that they're, you know, the only person dealing with this, that they can see light at the end of the tunnel. They can see other people who have gone through, you know, the same issues and resolved it. Sadly, we also have to prepare for the inevitability of losing the person. And with dementia, you lose them more than once. You lose the person in terms of how they potentially hollow out, so they, you know, they may not recognize their partner as time goes on, and then eventually, you know, the kind of the complexities of everything takes over, and sadly they pass away. Then we've got the resurgence of the carer. Suddenly they've got all this time, they don't have, you know, they don't know what to do. Their social network has diminished, and they have to start afresh. That again is another challenge. So we're there at every stage to help and support people, and that, you know, so that they can live their best life and to enjoy what they can enjoy whilst they can, and help them to find alternative ways of doing things that give them that. I mean, another kind of example, the intimacy, you know, one of the, sadly, incontinence, male couple, the one sort of individual said, that's an intimate kind of thing that they can do for their partner. In that instance, still living at home. You know, so there are different ways of maintaining that closeness, some of which would seem a bit bizarre for people who are not in the situation, but having that sense of love expressed is important and to maintain.
That's lovely, thank you. I think something I'd just like to pick up in the chat before we start to round today's session up, and I think this is a really important point actually, is John has said that there is definitely a lack of services when you get outside of areas such as London, Brighton and Manchester. You know, and I would say from the information that I've looked at, there are very heavily focused in certain areas. What can people do to find their peer groups, to find their support and their network if they're not within those areas where support is particularly prevalent? Sandra, were you within those areas? Was it not something you came
No, I'm
across?
outside those areas, and I felt like there was very little support for me and Hazel, whether we were LGBT or not.
Okay.
I did look at the Alzheimer's Society kind of, they had a section. Um, it didn't kind of really kind of work for me. Yeah, so it was very lonely.
So would it be fair to say we need to keep doing what we're doing, having these conversations and
Yes.
making this prevalent and part of what people need to hear? John, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to probably echo, and I'm sure Paul completely understands this as well, is that charities often pick up, the heavy work of providing this gap where there are no statutory services that are culturally competent and
Yeah.
available for LGBTQ plus people living with and affected by dementia. Those charities sort of step in. So maybe if people are in areas where there is might be an LGBT charity that's more focused on younger people or youth, maybe suggest that they start to put some resources into looking at typically older people's or people with dementias needs, for example. So and not being afraid, I guess, to connect with organizations that might be way out of your area, charitable organizations like Paul's or like Switchboard or LGBT Foundation in Manchester, for example, and just picking their brains and finding out. They will connect you wherever possible, because we hear so many stories of people living in very isolated pockets who are not in those metropolitan areas. And it's important to try. I think charities do incredible work.
It's networking, isn't it?
The
Network and growth.
Exactly that. They have those really valuable networks, sometimes way outside of their area. These small charities are punching so far above their weight that, I know somebody, for example, in the Switchboard peer support program, when it used to run online, was accessing from Belgium, for example. So there was nothing in their locality in Belgium, but Zoom brings us, or Teams or whatever, can bring us very very connected. Like sometimes technology has a real benefit, I guess, for connection where it's appropriate.
100%.
But not being afraid
Absolutely.
to reach out, I guess, to charities who might be in your area or outside of your area.
I think that brings us nicely to the close of today. And I was about to ask you, what is the one thing you'd like people to take away from today? John, I'd really like to say that I think that's probably an amazing message to give, that actually don't be afraid to reach out, do reach out further afield, because that support is there. And I think there's an absolute acknowledgement, isn't there, that it is very isolated at the moment. But if nobody's reaching out, it's not going to grow. So, network, share and push your local organisations to have these conversations.
Yeah.
Paul, what would you like people to take away from today?
So dementia doesn't take away from somebody's identity, their relationship or their life they've lived. Yeah, it's important to remember that everybody deserves to be treated with dignity and respect and compassion. And so when services are generally inclusive, it's wonderful, and it makes the whole kind of difficulty of a challenge so much easier. So I think the main thing to do is to continue to sort of be connected and have meaningful lives, and sort of just make the most of what you have. Don't live in the we can't do this anymore. Live in what you can do. Be positive.
Brilliant. Thanks, Paul. And finally, Sandra, what would your one takeaway be?
It would be just clearly saying that being LGBT does make a difference every single step of the way. And we have to find our ways of managing that, taking care and reveling in the times when we are really seen and really valued as LGBT people living with dementia.
Thank you. Guys, I can't thank you enough for this conversation. I think my takeaway is that underneath the undertone is celebrating who we are. And I think, you know what, I would say that across any community as well. It's important to celebrate who we are and enjoy the people that we've become and lived our best lives. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. We will put any resources talked about and furthermore on our resources pack, and you can see this again on our YouTube channel at the end. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.